Hi, this is Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. This is going to be the second part of my 10k scoop hand history review. As with part 1, the plan is to try and get through hands at a reasonable pace while sprinkling in some solver work here and there where it seems like it has potential to add the most value. We finished off part 1 with hand number 13, so we're going to begin this installment with hand number 14. Opening aces seems pretty uncontroversial and straightforward. Get flatted by Leteski in the small blind. This should be like a ton of pretty connected stuff. High pairs, Broadway rundowns, the stronger lower rundowns, especially if they're double suited, and maybe a little bit looser as well, depending on the individual's frame of mind. I think we mostly bet this particular combination. Like, we're obviously doing a decent amount of checking with aces. They don't achieve a whole lot by betting, and it's a pretty rare ace-ace combination that can bet 3 streets on this texture. The 9 is going to bias us towards aggression. You typically do more betting when you block the unpaired card, because not only do you remove some full houses, pocket 9s, king 9, but you also remove some potential bluffs. Like, he can take queen jack 9, queen 10 9, check raise it, or just any random 9, I suppose, but those combinations particularly. So when you have a queen 9 combination, it makes it pretty likely that you won't face a ton of aggression when you c-bet, and obviously getting check raise is kind of a problematic situation with this particular hand. Worth noting that out of position, when he cold calls the small blind, it's going to have a lot more king X, or some amount more king X at least, than when big blind cold calls. So those are some things to keep in mind generally, but in this spot I'd imagine we're mixing within the ace-ace hand class, and wouldn't totally hate flipping a coin with this combination, or making some kind of marginal exploit, but I think there's more. I think that this particular hand has more properties that argue for betting than argue for checking. We do go with check, which is fine, I guess. On the turn, I think most ace-ace is now strong enough to go for 2 streets of value. We likely want a few checks at equilibrium, mainly so that we can have some easy bet call hands on rivers when we double delay c-bet. It checks through and the river is, an 8 or whatever. He checks to us when we bet, and he check raises figuring we're capped. Well, it's nice to have some hands that are trivial calls against that line. The combinations that don't go for 2 streets are going to be those that perform the worst versus an OOP 2 street calling range. And our hand is actually kind of one of those. Blocking queen 9 removes combinations of queen queen, which is calling down 2 streets quite often. Some 9x, which can call down 2 streets on certain rivers. And the 9 loses some relevance as a full house now, because it's just not a particularly likely hand for out of position to have, and he can easily check raise most king X anyway, so its impact is more towards blocking the 9x cooldowns. And yeah, the queen 9 combination I think polarizes him more than others might, to better than aces and just air. He'll have fewer hands like queen jack, queen 10, ace 9, so I think check back is kind of reasonable, but bet would be kind of fine. We go with check, face, delay, stab, and very easy call. I think bluffing as Leteski is fine. The value of betting a hand like this isn't so much that I'll start folding a ton of better stuff, but more that when we both have pretty similar hands, he'll win the pot, and if he checks, I'll win the pot, kind of thing. So to preempt getting bluffed by a similar hand is the main source of EV when he goes to the delay stab. But if he's taking that line, I don't think he wants much or many 7-6 combinations, because given that I open in early position, my range is quite coordinated and connected, and so if I have give-ups, they're quite often like 8-7-6-5, ace-10-7-6, like 2-card zero gappers feature quite heavily in my overall distribution, so I'd say he has a little bit too much interaction with my folding range when he has 7-6. Maybe if he's cold call pre-flop with like ace queen 5-3 double suited, that hand will make a better bluff, or even just a pip or 2 lower than the 7-6. So yeah, I think he should probably give up. Obviously, once he bets, I have trivial decision. easy ISO with 3 cards that are pretty good and 1 that isn't so much. And I think this is a pretty good c-bet spot. Nut backdoor flush draw. A gut shot that's reasonably likely to be good. A decent amount of an equity advantage as well too, I think. So betting seems fine. And we generally, like, if we're checking back some 10-8, then having a deuce in our hand, in my experience, just always biases is that, or always inclines us that little bit more towards going the aggressive route. So ace 10-8 deuce seems a pretty good candidate for a c-bet bluff. And on turn, we make the second nuts. This is a pretty strong 10-8 combination to be betting. Like, I can, with SPR of less than 4, I can see just going for it all with every 10-8 plus combination. But even if we decide for whatever reason we want to check some 10-8, I would imagine it would be more like queen 10-8. That kind of thing. So my combination unblocks all the pairs, so he has a ton of viable bluff catchers. And I also have the ace-10 Broadway gutter, so I have a little bit of emergency equity should I happen to run into the top of his range. And just set it up. Like, pick a sizing big enough that I can make a shove on the river, so anything like 2/3, 3/4 pot or higher. Go for it all on the river, and run into the nuts. His hand can do different things on both flop and turn. It can lead or check raise on the flop. It can maybe lead turn. I don't think he check raises once he checks and I bet. The Jack 5 does give him a small free roll if I have King 10, but that's not a sizable consideration. I think it's outweighed by the fact that when he blocks 2 pairs, I have a much more polarized 2-barrel distribution. Like, I haven't made a mistaken value bet with Queen Jack or a set of 5s or something like that. So I have a lot more like straights and air, basically, or straights and bluffs. And so he does fine just keeping me in. Next hand. So pretty standard 3-bet with double suited kings versus the button. I think this is probably a 3-bet versus anyone at the table given stack sizes. And on the flop, you have to be a little bit careful here because the SPR is close to 6, which is a fair amount higher than you'd see in like a 100 big blind cash game environment 3-bet pot. So IP can apply more leverage or apply more pressure, use leverage to apply more pressure. There we are. If I start like c-betting too many merged over pairs, and just put me in tough spots with a bunch of those. So definitely want to be checking some over pairs. Definitely want to be checking some over pairs with flush draws. But 7x plus flush draw, pretty high flush draw, then those over pairs with those properties are going to do more betting. 7x obviously removes some full houses. The flush draw gives my hand the ability to bet more than one street for value, and so on and so forth. We go with small, get called. Turn looks like a super clear check. I don't have a hand strong enough to bet all 3 streets, and therefore I can go bet, bet, check, or bet, check, bet. And I think I prefer bet, check, bet. If he checks back, I have a slam dunk river value bet. I also get a bet in against his flop floats that turn into that become turn bluffs that would obviously just fold versus double barrel. If I had the nut flush, maybe I can go. I can probably go all 3 streets with the nut flush and a 7 blocker, but this hand's just slightly too weak. And we definitely obviously want to be checking some hands that have an easy time continuing versus at least one street of aggression. If we just bet all our flushes and all our checks like ace, ace, 10, 5 or whatever, then we're setting ourselves up for kind of a disaster. He goes with big bet, and we just obviously call. River's kind of interesting. I think it's a spot where I actually want to lead, and that's kind of an uncommon line. Check call turn or bet flop, check call turn, lead river. But I think the runouts fits it pretty well. So obviously the river trims his 4x combination significantly. I think the main problem though is I just don't get money in good by checking river. Like, he shouldn't be bluffing very much at all. Like, obviously Solverland, etc., etc., etc. But in the real world, I think people often just give this spot up because it's not a fantastic, when I 3-bet pre, I have a ton of overpairs, and it's not a great idea to try and bluff me off Kings Plus on this run out. But if I bet, I can compel calls from either turn bluffs that have now become bluff catchers, like 9988, or turn value bets that would check back versus river check, but which can potentially hero call versus river lead. Like ace, jack, jack 8 with the nut flush, ace of spades, 8-8-7, that kind of thing. And I can have I have some hands here that I can turn into bluffs. Like I can turn low flushes with like ace X low flushes into bluffs, ace 10-9-8 with the 10 high flush, that kind of thing. Aiming both to fold out some better flushes and then potentially even some of his turn bluffs that now win, like, hands with low or mid pocket pairs. So yeah, I think this is actually a pretty good spot just to shove, especially with SPR of less than 1. But we go with check, and yeah, he shuts down a pretty good combination to be bluffing turn, and I assume frequently barreling through as like the nut 3-barrel bluff combination on every river, pretty much every river except this one. So whilst I'm trying to be relatively restrictive with the use of Munker sims, especially post-lot sims, which can go quite in-depth during this series for the sake of runtime, I ended up deciding that this situation was interesting enough to take a little bit more of a look at. So we're going to start out on the turn with an SPR a shade above 3 as it was in the actual hand. Kind of whiz through turn action. Out of position has pure check. More or less pure check. IP picks the size that IP chose in game, and not even worth checking. He's obviously going to have the combination that he had in game. When he does go with B67, then out of position is going to defend some hands like kings and aces. Kings, aces, not better than a 4, like roughly half of them. And those are just going to be skewed towards combinations that have useful blockers. So if we have like the nut flush blocker, we're going to defend more. If we have a 7, 6, we defend a little bit more, and so on and so forth. So we're basically looking to fold the combinations that interact the least with the board. Not only because then, like sometimes if we have, ace a7, we have a sliver of equity against a hand like 4x. But also just because we block our opponent's profitable river barrels, and so he might be one and dunning it on the turn at a higher frequency if we have a card like the ace of spades in our hand, like that kind of thing. Anyway, we go with call and end up with this river. Using the board overview, we can see that, unsurprisingly, out of position is going to have pure check on the vast majority of rivers. In fact, he's essentially going to have pure check on every river, apart from the ace of spades, where he gets a little bit of bet, and the actual river we saw in game, where he switches from more or less pure checking to more or less pure betting. There are some hands that he wants to check in, as in this isn't a situation you'd want to simplify this range out, because there's pretty clear trends. It's just like mid pairs with flushes get in there quite a lot. If we have a hand, for example, like better than 10s, not better than queens, then we're doing quite a bit of checking with those. We have a flush or a mid flush and that kind of thing. So that means that we're going to bluff all of our straights. So everything worse than a flush is just going to get bluffed always. Everything worse than something like the queen high flush is going to get bluffed actually pretty much always. So we're turning a lot of hands with some amount of showdown value into bluff, just because the river is so good for us. It heavily restricts his 4x frequency. He's not going to have that much 6-6. He can have like 7s as a viable combination, but it's one combination in amongst a whole range, and the SPR is only 1, so our downside is pretty heavily capped. Our value bets seem to start around, like we have 2 sizings here, and they both have pretty clear shapes. Our value bets for the small sizings seem to start out around jacks. Jacks is betting about half the time. Queens is betting basically all the time for the small sizing. And then our big bets start out around pocket kings. Generally skewing more towards the big sizing when we have full house blockers. So better than kings, not better than pocket sixes, let's say. And then if we have a 7 or a 6, we do a fair amount more big betting. We're also a little bit more inclined to go big with these value combinations when we don't block other Broadway pairs. So, for example, if we have a combination like king, king, queen, jack, that's going to go small and small most of the time and big very infrequently because, when we have kings, we're mostly trying to get called by queens and jacks, that kind of thing. When we do go with big bet, versus either sizing, IP is going to end up folding at a pretty high frequency, like half the time versus half pot, over 60% of the time versus full pot. Versus full pot, he's just going to call some of his Broadway pairs. So let's say better than 10s, not better than kings. Kings is basically always going to call. So this is where he starts to find his calls. And the one clear mechanic that's in evidence is that he calls more if he has fewer spades in his hand. So if we give him no spades, he calls a bit more. Sorry, if we give him no flush, he calls a bit more. If we give him no spade of any kind, he basically always calls. And this is because if we as out of position have a lot of flushes and we're bluffing a lot of flushes, then he unblocks our bluffs. A final thing worth pointing out is that versus check, when it does happen, IP is meant to be bluffing pretty aggressively. Like if we just give him worse than the queen high flush, he's bluffing like well over half the time. And I'm not convinced this is a thing in the real world. I think that it's very easy to take kind of a simplistic viewpoint of this spot where this river is just very clearly good for the out of position player's range, and IP can easily just I can easily imagine some in position players who just never bluff this spot. I can even more easily imagine in position players who are going to not find all of these bluffs at the required frequency. If we give them like worse than the 10 high flush, let's say. Bet frequency goes up and up and up. And I don't think that all of these hands are getting bluffed. And what that means is that the EV of checking a combination like kings is going to be even lower the EV of checking any viable value bet is going to be lower in the real world than at equilibrium, because in the real world, part of the EV of checking one of those hands is that we can induce a bluff, and we're just not getting hit with that bluff. So I would actually say, although it sounds kind of bizarre, that the best option with a lot of king-king combinations, if you were to check them for whatever reason, you shouldn't, like ever, but if you did, then I'd say check fold is actually probably going to perform better in the real world against than check calling, which is obviously what the solver's going to do. Our hand, king's not better than aces. It's always going to bet and has 7 mixed sizings, and when we have a 7, we're going to skew pretty heavily towards the big bet. So yeah, that was an opportunity missed, but oh well, that's what you do hand history reviews for, I guess. And now on with the rest of the footage. Okay, so next hand, we have pretty easy open on the button. Can maybe start sizing down, but I would imagine, despite the blinds looking like they may be on getting towards the high side, this is early enough in the tournament that I'm still playing chip EV, and chip EV probably doesn't include any opens for smaller than full pot. Kajuk peels, and I'm just going to... So, yeah, I go with flop c-bet. I think I'd mostly check this hand back now. Mid pairs tend not to do much c-bet bluffing because they almost always have poor removal effects. I need my opponents to have, like if I'm bluffing, I need my opponents to have like 7-6 combinations so that they can just fold them. That said, I don't think c-betting is that bad because my hand is kind of vulnerable to OOP probes. Like even a lot of cards where I kind of improve, I might have to fold versus big probe. And OOP can be probing turn relatively aggressively when I check back a texture like this. So yeah, a lot of my outs are kind of vulnerable, and Kash's range is kind of weak because he's going to 3-bet like 100% of his overpairs pre-flop. He's probably going to 3-bet quite a bit of his queen-queen pre-flop. He's also going to 3-bet combinations of other hands that do well on this board, like ace-queen XX, queen-jack 10x. I wrap around the 8, so I have a little bit of actual equity that I somewhat retain against his continues. And it is worth noting that we're going to see bet hands like this. By like this, I guess I mean like bluffs with a marginally useful blocker. Like in this instance, I'm using the 8 to trim a few continues with hands like 10-9-8x or, Queen 8, whatever. So I'm assuming I get check raised a little bit less often when I block an 8 and so on and so forth. And we do bet hands like that more when we have a pocket pair, because the EV of checking is lower. And when your hand has some amount of immediate showdown value, you always need to consider the EV of the alternative option. And in this instance, because I have a pocket pair, I'm going to improve on turn at a lower frequency, and therefore the EV of checking is going to be decreased relative to if I have a hand like 8-7-6-5. So I'd imagine this is going to be not far from okay-ish in Solverland, and probably some kind of mix, as most things are. That said, I don't have great 2-barrel prospects. In fact, my 2-barrel prospects are, I would say, pretty disastrous. I can check back some combinations that give my range protection and ensure that Kaju can't have like a ridiculously aggressive turn probe strategy. I can check back some Queen X, I can check back some pair plus gutters, Jack 10-8, that kind of thing. If my hand did have better blockers to his continues, like 9-9, like if we make it 9-9-8-7, 10-10-8-7, where I start to block some of his gut shots and wraps and, pair plus backdoor draws and stuff like that. Those combinations I'd like c-betting more, although they're kind of a little bit similar to my hand, but they just make it so that he folds a couple % more. And obviously with a hand like this, that's going to be best case scenario. Last point would be that it's worth bearing in mind anytime you're IPPFR in this kind of situation, like shallowish stack in a tournament or shallowish SPR in a tournament, that people are often going to lead less than they're meant to as the out of position player, which typically means you as the in position player should be chilling with some of your more dubious c-bet candidates. I think it's fair to say that this hand is one such candidate. Like it's not a bad c-bet, but it gets bad pretty quickly if I'm wrong about Kaju's pre-flop 3-bet strategy, or if Kaju like checks range to me on this flop. Like either of those two things result in this c-bet going from like okay-ish to probably not that good, which sounds like a relatively mild progression, I suppose, but there we are. So we go with bet and get it through. And obviously this is going to be the easiest squeeze in the world. From what I've seen at around this like SPR 1.5, even on paired boards as the out of position 3-better, your range starts to get some shoves, especially on boards where there are a lot of draws, like quite coordinated textures. So 10-10-8 flush draw definitely qualifies as a member of that category. A small bet's still fine if you have a super dry paired texture, or even just, even if we make this like 10-10-6 rainbow, I would imagine small bet does quite well. But as the board becomes more like this, then there are just more hands that the big bet denies equity to. Like I can bet big and make him fold some like Jack 9 kind of thing, or at least make Jack 9 very close to indifferent, decrease the EV of calling it if he decides to. So I think two sizings here works pretty well, and that's just going to have that strategy is going to have the shape that you normally see in a 3-bet out of position scenario, where the small sizing is polar. It has like the no hope of bluffs and then the strong value. And the large sizing is more merged, contains more of the mid-strength hands that benefit more from forcing immediate folds and don't play particularly well down streets and so on and so forth. The only issue here is where do you put the cutoff? Like when does your hand become strong enough that it goes in the small sizing? Like aces and the nut flush draw, I'd imagine definitely qualifies. Aces and any flush draw gets a little bit thinner. So I can see going big with this hand, and like aces, low clubs in general, because I do unblock a ton of straight draws. The thing is, though, that I don't lose all that much by letting him peel a straight draw, because he can easily peel and end up turning himself dead. And even if I don't cover his straight draw out, he won't have much. He won't be winning many chips by calling. Basically, like his hand doesn't have a ton of equity. Or his range of straight draws combinations don't have a ton of equity against this specific hand. So it could be that any aces plus flush draw combination is just good enough to go in small. don't have a super strong opinion. If I had aces and the stronger flush draws, I think, yeah, this big bet would be a clear mistake, but I don't hate it with this precise combination. We lose to the nuts, which is kind of tough to argue with. Slam dunk c-bet here, bottom pair gut shot, so pretty polar future distribution, and with my hand, and massive polarity advantage with my range. Get 3-bet by Oddson, which isn't all that much fun. Like, my hand is the kind that's a little bit easy to be dominated by his range, because when he 3-bets versus MP, it's like good aces, well, yeah, all aces, most likely, realistically. And then like ace, king, king, and then the very best double suited rundowns, and those may include some combinations that kind of pip my hand. That said, I just don't think I do much folding of double suited hands, and I do have a 3-card zero gapper, so yeah, I think end up having to call. He goes with half pot on an ace high board. I think this is just going to be a fold. Like, I semi-wrap around the 9, but not really. It's like, there are a couple of things. I mean, firstly, he bets half pot, so this is probably the sizing where I start to fold my weak flush draws. Against third pot, I might just have to continue. You always have to be a little bit more cautious on, like, ace 9-4 when the ace isn't a club, because then there are just, like, not only is there ace-ace, but there's ace-ace with nut clubs, or just ace-x with nut clubs. Like, it's easier for him to have a combination that crushes mine, basically. So yeah, I think this is pretty easy fold. I mean, Cool can't be winning much, and there are certain c-bet strategies against which Cool is losing quite a bit. 40 big blinds, very standard 3-bet get in against skill in the cutoff. Get it in, and double up aces. Our turn to have the aces, and we win the blinds. Get 3-bet by TJ here. There was a point in time where I'd assumed that this hand did a lot of folding versus 3-bets, because it seems like it's very dominated by TJ's value region. But in my experience from having looked into the fair amount of pre-flop sims in different structures, the hand class double suited ace-x with a pocket pair just almost never folds. I assume because it has a pretty polar equity distribution, pretty polar post-flop equity distribution. Like, it flops, sets and top two and nut and second nut flush draws a lot, like that kind of thing. And then you obviously brick at times, but it's the kind of hand that doesn't tend to get you into too much trouble. So we do peel, and we're going to take a look at this spot in the solver. So what we're looking at here are two sims run with all of the same inputs, with one exception. The pre-flop ranges are the same, the board is obviously the same, the options available to both parties are the same. What I've tweaked is the SPR. So on the right-hand side is the SPR that will be created were this hand played in a 100 big blind starting stack cash game environment. And on the left-hand side we have SPR2, which is closer to what it was in our hand. And we can see a pretty significant strategy shift. Like, at some point, as the SPR shallows out from 3.5 and approaches 2, we lose these small and medium bets, and we just gain a pure big bet sizing. Like, we're betting at roughly the same frequency over on the left, but our sizing preferences have changed significantly. And the result is that we're actually putting in a bunch more money, because we're betting at roughly the same frequency, but when we do, we're always betting for full pot. And there are a lot of hands that move between various ranges as you shift the SPR downward. And I think that offers an indication as to what the solver is seeing that it wants to do differently in this case. So we're going to start out with our hand, our hand class, as a reference point. So ace king with the nut flush draw without better than aces with a pocket pair. And this is just pure leading for the big size at SPR2. Over here, it's high frequency checking, a little bit of small and mid-sized betting, but you probably wouldn't be doing a great deal wrong were you to simplify that out. There's no hand that wants to lead, I think, as a pure strategy. Although that's, I guess, somewhat of technical point, doesn't, as in like technical in the sense it doesn't have actually much applicability. I think the reason that we don't choose to lead this hand very frequently over on the right, despite blocking some of IP's obvious c-bet candidates by having the ace of hearts and a king in our hand, is they don't actually have fantastic turn playability. Like, imagine we go with third pot here and IP calls, as he's going to do at a pretty significant frequency. Now the SPR is 2 and we have to deal with the 6 of spades on the turn, or the 9 of clubs, or the queen of diamonds. There are so many turns, even a brick in somewhere, like even the 3 of spades. It's like, well, I assume we're obviously now stacking off, but like if we bet, quite often we're going to run into some kind of slightly better made hand, and there's only a card to come now. And if we turn a heart, then it's a little bit, it's not impossible to get action, obviously, and we'll certainly stack every other flush, but it's a little bit tricky to get action on certain textures. And in general terms, it seems like this hand has quite a bit of equity, but doesn't actually have fantastic playability as the out of position player. And so we solve that problem by checking and versus any sizing, always going for the check raise, because it does play well to get all the money in. Commit a bunch of weaker flush draws. We can get it in good against a hand like, Queen Jack 10x with worse hearts, that kind of thing. And over here, that isn't that much of a consideration, because we just have this full pot bet size where we can just shovel money in. We can apply some pressure to slightly better hands, like maybe, ace 4-3 folds and stuff like that. And there are a bunch more hands that have this kind of property. Like, if you lead for a small sizing and get called, they don't actually play fantastically. So, I have a couple examples. Queen Jack 10 is one, starts leading a whole bunch of the time. I haven't even specified with or without a flush draw, doesn't really matter. Whereas over here, mostly checking, a little bit of small betting. We like shoveling money with this hand. It's an even bigger result if we can get ace to fold with this hand, specifically ever. Also, some of the stronger made hands that don't have amazing playability, like King 10 without hearts, is starting to do a whole bunch of big betting. And if you see like a lot of the combinations that are big betting, King 10 deuce deuce is like the ultimate combination that doesn't play well across multiple streets, is pure leading. Whereas over here, no big betting and a lot more checking going on. Any flush draw that isn't better than a king is mainly checking over at 100 big blinds and starts shoveling in a whole bunch of money now, especially if it's a nut flush draw. We'll do a nut flush draw, betting full pot 2/3 of the time. And over here, kind of the same thing, like still mostly checking and mixing between small and medium when it does. And definitely this full pot bet size doesn't exist. So it broadly looks like the SPR is low enough that it's partially, I think, like balance considerations assume greater weight at higher SPR. So, we get to pack a bunch of nut flush draws into our full pot bet size, and it's not really clear that the imposition gets to do a bunch about it. Like, he's not going to start, folding us off flushes if we don't full pot flop, something else happens, because our stack off threshold is reduced. The informational advantage he can gain is also reduced because he can't make make use of that information because the betting will have been terminated by the first big bet that goes on, and so we get a few more things. We get a few more lines like this at higher frequencies. The other thing, of course, I suppose, is that check raise over on the right has significantly increased fold equity. Like, if we check IP bets and we go all in here, like we check IP bets and we go all in, he doesn't have that high of a fold frequency. Whereas with the same action over on the right, he's now folding half the time against a third of the time over here. So check raise having more fold equity is good for check raising hands like ours, and not being so concerned about balance at shallower SPR is pretty good for shoveling in money with a bunch of high equity draws that have kind of tricky turns to play, were they not to immediately hit. Back to the hand, we go with big bet, which I think is fine. TJ appeals. Turn the nuts, and I think this is a spot where we just go all in. I I don't see him folding any straight because we can. Yeah, I don't see him folding a straight. Probably won't be very happy about it. Our betting range does contain a lot of flush draws, both in Solverland and I would imagine in the perception of most opponents. But potting, I guess we can pod and check King 10 and stuff like that. So checking with a king in our hand isn't the worst idea. The other thing about the king in your hand, though, is that it makes it less likely he has a hand like ace, ace, king, queen that might actually fold, and more likely he has, two pair, at least let's say two pair plus, which mostly gets it in. I think definitely sets are priced in. Most straights, I think, can just shrug and call it off. And yeah, three, full pot flop, check turn, even if it checks through, I then shove river, it just looks, it doesn't look convincing as a bluff, put it that way. So we go all in. Pretty easy ISO here, I think, with a relatively coordinated hand, certainly decent 3-card combination. On the flop, the flop isn't great for my range, and a lot actually, again, depends on whether Flat Cat has a leading strategy. He definitely should on this texture. Because if he does have a leading strategy, then c-betting gets obviously a little bit better. And my hand has a few reasonable c-bet components. It has a nut gut shot, it has a board pair, which both gives it outs and blockers. Also, I think I prefer betting the no backdoor flush draw combination here because it has, again, lower EV in the check line. I can check back, queen 10 of spades and just auto call a quarter of the deck, whereas that isn't available to me with this combination. Even if Flat Cat doesn't have leads, I would imagine he does have a decently aggressive turn probing strategy. You can't overdo the c-betting on this kind of board texture as the imposition player, but yeah, I think just because the EV of checking is so low and I have semi-decent removal with my 9 and whatever else, I think this is probably a decent spot to c-bet the kind of a polar mix of this hand. So you c-bet the 2 backdoor flush draw combinations because they're the best, they have the most equity, and the 0 backdoor flush draw combinations because they're the worst and have the lowest EV check, and then you check back the single, queen 10 of spades, queen 10 of hearts, that kind of thing. The single backdoor flush draws. We do go with check, which is not exactly bad, but yeah, I think c-betting would have been reasonable. And this is part of the problem. I think we call here, and it's not fun, but he can be probing some pretty merged stuff against which we have an immediate price. He can just have ace, king, 8, 5, and we actually have a price to continue. I guess I'd rather have a spade in my hand so that I'd feel a little bit better about bluffing rivered spades if he checks. I kind of have to bluff rivered spades, I think, if I call and he does check. But it's going to be lower EV with this combination, so the value of that decreases. Yeah, I think I'm just about stuck peeling here, but it's not a fun spot. We go with fold, which seems a little bit tight. If he bet half pot or something, then that starts to become okay. I think third pot's too small for me to be folding pair plus gut shot. Plus overs. Onto this hand, and what I want to talk about here is what ace-ace is going to limp, because we definitely have a limping range. And if we're going to have a limping range, then as the out of position player, we get limp re-raises. That's one area, or that's one way in which IP and OOP limping ranges differ. IP limping ranges contain almost no, or literally no, limp re-raises, whereas OOP do, because obviously the value of limp calling is lower. So if we have a limping range, we need some limp re-raises. If we have re-raises, we kind of have to have some aces in our limping range. Otherwise, we're just putting in a whole bunch of money and we never have the nuts. That's not exactly a fantastic, that's not exactly the setup for a solid strategy. And as I recall from a video I made a while ago where I was talking about, I think I was talking about small blind limping again, actually. But it was a slightly different context. It was, the video was called, it was something to do with the Power Fest, 5K Power Fest analysis or something like that. And I think I remember talking about how the strategy of the small blind differed between 25 and 50 big blinds. We're just going to stick with 50 big blinds for this video, since it's roughly the stack size that we were at, a little bit deeper, I guess, but whatever. So if we run it around to the small blind here, then yeah, he's limping more than he's raising. And when he gets ISO'd, he has 10% re-raise. So, there's no way he doesn't have to be limping some ace-ace combinations. So he's limping nearly half of them. And so if I were to just leave you with that, then that's kind of useless, because that's me telling you something and then you have to go figure out how to implement it yourself. So the next step has to be, okay, so which aces are limping? And there are some pretty clearly obvious trends. The rainbow aces are limping a lot less because they value the immediate steal more. They don't want to play post flop as often, and so therefore they'll often be biased towards aggression in this kind of situation. Conversely, when we have double suited aces, we're going to be limping more, kind of for the opposite reason. Firstly, if we limp and get in a 3-bet, then we've created a big pot with the top of our range, which is great. If it does check through, then that's not fun, but at least our hand does a good job of realizing it, and likely over-realizing equity post-flop. So yeah, it looks like the worst, put crudely, the best combinations are limping and the worst combinations are raising. Taking that out and just restricting ourselves to the single-suited combinations. If we have a Broadway, like a king or a queen, we do more raising. I think the reason there is that we block ISOs. Like, IP's ISOs are always, we don't know what his ISO strategy is going to be, but it's fair to say it'll always include ISOing, king, queen, jack, 10 kind of thing. And so we weaken his range slightly when we have other Broadway combinations, make it more likely he checks through, and therefore the value of limping decreases. So we opt to raise those hands at a higher frequency. Some other things too, a lot of the 2-card zero gappers, so jack 10, 10-9, 9-8, like down to, I think it was 6-5, might start raise, yeah. So 7-6, pure calls, 6-5, pure raises. So the 2-card zero gappers do a lot of limping, until they get pretty low. Same reason, like the general concept is we limp the hands that do well post-flop, and 2-card zero gappers flop a lot of like overpair plus open-ender, like that kind of thing. Good single gappers as well, jack 9, 10-8, that kind of thing. Those are limping. Again, better playability, that's the overall concept. If we have ace-ace 8-3, we're pure raising. If we have ace-ace jack 10, we're pure limping. So those are some examples, but if you were to just like put them all under a broad conceptual umbrella, hands that play well, limp. Hands that play badly, raise. We open our hand, which is like whatever, and TJ just folds. So that was obviously a nothing hand, but I thought it was a good opportunity to discuss the concept. I think this is just going to be a call. Like, this is the type of hand that you probably just fold in the cash game with rake and whatever else and feel fine about it. But you need to start doing a lot more cold calling in the small blind when you're playing tournaments, because the fact that there's no rake and that people often play a little bit more passively is going to do good things for the EV of getting involved at a higher frequency, basically. If we do a quick check, for example, the smaller sizing is obviously also a huge factor. Like, we're cold calling nearly 20% in the small blind over here. 8-8-5-4 just always gets in there. Even if we shallow the stacks out, then we're still going to see a decent amount of small blind cold calling. Obviously, normally you'd see less because 3-bet stack off thresholds decrease, therefore we get to do more 3-betting. But we're still going to cold call decently often, and the 8-8-5-4 still gets in there, although now it's significantly closer to indifferent. Go with cool, and damn few comes along. I don't think we have leads here. I'm fine just checking range anyway. Dan Few's going to lead. To be fair, I had seen him lead before that. thoughts but sprang into my mind. But yeah, it is also a thing that Danfu is going to lead textures like this quite a bit. So I probably don't want many, even if I do have leads, I probably don't want to lead much nutted stuff that unblocks his stabs. Anyway, Flat Cat comes along. If this had been heads up, like Danfu or Flat Cat had stabbed, I think check call could be okay with no club blocker. Like that's often something you see on made straight boards. You're more passive out of position when you don't have a blocker to the flush draw, because your hand makes a worse cooldown. I assume because your hand makes a worse cooldown on flush completing runouts. So you keep the pot smaller. Your hand's a little bit more turn determined as well. Like it stays the nuts, or it gets devalued significantly because it's either the nuts or a very bad bluff catcher. So that kind of idea. But once it goes 3-way, a couple things happen. Firstly, it becomes quite likely the Flat Cat's just going with it. If somewhat reluctantly, like the top of his range is obviously doing quite a bit of shoving with, but he doesn't have all that many hands that call and then fold to getting almost what would be almost 2-1 with dead money. And secondly, probably more importantly, Danfu's turn barrel percentage decreases significantly, because like if Danfu stabs an eye call or Flat Cat stabs an eye call, then they'll both probably barrel turns quite often, because this flop looks like it's bad for my range. It looks like I have, Ace King Jack 7 with the second nut flush draw, like that. Like I have a ton of that, or King with spades and a 6, like that kind of stuff. And those hands are very susceptible to further aggression. Once it goes 3-way, everyone's ranges just get a little bit tighter. And so it becomes that much more likely that Danfu plays an honest turn strategy. And a lot of the EV of calling is getting another street from his bluffs. And when that happens at a much lower frequency, because his bluffing requirements become a lot more rigorous, the EV of slow playing decreases along with his turn aggression frequency, basically. So I think this hand becomes a pretty straightforward check raise. We also unblock a ton of other hands that are still continuing. So Flat Cat gets it in, and we run it. Doesn't look like the best river for us. And yeah, so he's never folding that hand, but it was nice to get all the money in on the flop against it. Like we're not crushing it, but we've turned a situation where we were out of position with a hand that didn't play well across future streets into we're all in, there's no more betting, and we had some amount of an equity advantage. So that's going to work out pretty well for us in the long term. Okay, I think that's a decent spot to wrap up part 2. Hopefully everyone enjoyed. As always, questions, comments, feedback gratefully received in the thread below or elsewhere. And until next time, it's been Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. Take care.